The encrypted alert came with a red priority mark, an override authority code hardwired into the message header, a type reserved only for existential threats. And when it hit the mainframe of Sol Command's orbital control, in the middle of a strategy audit, Vice Admiral Celine Roth did not pause to ask who had triggered it or why the system hadn't auto-sorted it to diplomatic filters, because the source signature was unmistakably human, yet the pattern laced inside was not Roth. A woman with a record that spanned 32 years and 7 cold engagements with non-human sovereignties. Was not prone to panic or projection. She was deliberate, analytical, known for balancing military logic with civilian consideration, and she had personally written half the retaliation protocols used in human-alien conflict arbitration. Yet, the data stream crawling across her command tablet forced her to make one decision: instantly lock down all orbital transmission, pathways from Mars to Titan, and seal the ArcNet interface, in case it had already spread across the room, seated beneath. The shifting hologram of the outer system. Director Cal Venner of Deep Watch Intelligence leaned forward with a tight jaw and a voice that rarely rose above a calculated whisper. But now it broke that pattern just slightly as he said, "Admiral, that's not just a breach. They're inside. Our Tier 1 satellites, enfolding our encryption keys into recursive logic traps that make it look like we did this to ourselves. They're not stealing our data. They're rewriting our memory of it." "Entity Zero," Roth said, not as a question, but with the grim certainty of someone who had survived long enough to know that silence in space didn't mean safety. It only meant your sensors weren't fast enough. Venner nodded once, slow and deliberate, because he had once been the only surviving analyst from the Andros incident, where an entire research station disappeared along with its star. And he had spent the last 2 decades reviewing spectral residue and cross-checking anomaly logs for traces of the black ship, convinced it would return, though no one had listened to his warnings until now. "I want a civilian net blackout across all colonies within 3 light minutes of Sol. No broadcasts, no research pings, no unsanctioned drone movements, and scramble every off-grid recon AI with intrusion counter protocols. We are not asking permission from the Council for this. We're issuing a state defense override under Clause 7 of the Sol Concord," Roth ordered, and she did not raise her voice either, because in this command room, calmness was pressure applied with precision it took exactly 6 minutes for. The first visual to reach them, an orbital lens deep past Neptune's far orbit, showed it. Massive, still, and utterly silent, blacker than the void around it, and shaped with angles that interfered with the human mind's ability to judge scale or motion. But it was there, hanging just inside Sol's gravitational boundary, like a question. No one had an answer for. "The black ship is back," Venner said, and for a long moment, the command floor fell quiet, not with fear, but with calculation, with analysis, with the shared awareness that this was not an act of war. Not yet, because the black ship did not arrive to destroy. It arrived to watch, and this time, it wasn't alone. 3 smaller vessels had followed it in, not in formation, and not broadcasting any signal known to interstellar traffic law. Yet they moved with a grace that suggested shared intent, each one gliding through the outer orbital dust fields, like they were scanning more than space, like they were listening to the gravitational rhythm of the system itself, and adjusting their path based on what it whispered. Roth stood motionless in the elevated command ring, not because she was stunned, but because her mind was already separating possibilities from noise, categorizing threats by pattern stability, and prioritizing protocol responses. Her silence was the kind that made junior officers check their posture twice and only speak when spoken to. And when she finally spoke, it was with that same dry clarity that had once stopped the weapons tribunal in its tracks. "They're evaluating our reaction time, not our readiness. This is a behavioral test wrapped in tactical observation, and those 3 smaller ships are probes with cognition thresholds high enough to respond in real time to human decision branches, which means anything we do now becomes part of their baseline model of us. So we do not give them pattern predictability. We give them human volatility. Beside her, Captain Eli Draven nodded. A field strategist with a background in border negotiations and asymmetrical deterrence doctrine. His talent wasn't aggression, but redirection, knowing exactly how to pivot hostile attention without lighting the match that burned the table. And he began issuing the kind of split deployments that made no sense on a standard war map, but would scramble any predictive model trying to categorize human intent. We're going dark in this hemisphere and overexposing on the Titan flank. Make them think we're pivoting assets toward Saturn. Then leak a controlled feed from Mars Command, showing a false flagship prepping near Phobos. And let's tether it to an outdated broadcast node so they know it's bait. I want to see which of them takes it, and how they respond to deception that's too obvious to be real, Draven instructed. His tone calm, deliberate, as though he were planning a training exercise, not a counter-op against the most enigmatic force known to human intelligence. Venner worked in parallel, pulling predictive heat mapping from the intelligence core and layering it over the most recent orbital analytics, then narrowed his eyes at a quiet anomaly on the far edge of the system's heliosphere. A subtle shift in energy pressure that wasn't shaped like a ship, but like a presence. They're not just testing our reaction to force. They're measuring our willingness to escalate. And if we react like prey, they'll define us as prey for all time. We cannot be passive. But we cannot be irrational either, he said, and his voice had returned to that low, steady cadence that marked when he was thinking beyond the board, into the mind of the enemy itself, or across the command board. Every major AI node began spooling. Deep logic scenarios, none of which ended in guaranteed survival, and Roth glanced over the data streams without blinking, then keyed in an override herself. Something that bypassed standard diplomacy and strategic delay. Activate Sunlight Protocol in classified mode. Deploy ghost satellites with embedded solar interference probes near Mercury's burn orbit. We are not striking. We are letting them know we could. And if they don't understand the message, they'll see it when our star pulses differently than the one they mapped, she said, not with threat, but with the cold tone of a commander speaking to the mathematics of war itself. No one spoke after that, because they all understood the weight of it. The silence that followed wasn't empty or waiting for orders. It was the kind of silence that came before gravity shifted and history bent in a new direction that no one could reverse once it had begun. The diplomatic vessel, Galileo's Mercy, left from Europa Station, under full stealth mesh and a diplomatic clearance that had not been used since the end of Vicenthian standoff. Its hull was lined with zero-aggression lattice fields and bore the insignia of the Interstellar Concord. Though no one on board truly believed that Entity Zero recognized such emblems as anything more than ornamental Ambassador Illinger stood at the core of the pressurized diplomatic ring, her posture straight, despite the slight tremor in the gravity dampeners, and her expression unreadable to all but those who had served beside her during the Trinaxis reconciliation, where she had talked down an entire war fleet by quoting the enemy's own honor codes back at them until they agreed to self-sanction their weapon systems for 70 cycles. She did not believe in charm or pressure, only in precision, and she had studied every known anomaly, every quantum signature, every record fragment left behind in the wake of the Black Ship's first arrival, enough to know that they did not speak with voices or symbols, but with structures and patterns that revealed intent only to those who knew how to slow their perception and listen without expecting anything familiar. At her side, Chief Communications Architect Nalin Vire adjusted the entangled signal filters. On the AI translator, a quiet man with a reputation for reprogramming obsolete machine languages into predictive diplomatic cues. And his fingers moved across the interface with the stillness of someone who thought better in motion and only spoke when the variables demanded speech. They're not sending language. They're sending architecture, Nayland said, his voice even, his eyes on the slowly unfolding construct outside the ship, where a lattice of black reflective material was growing in geometric coils, not connected to any vessel by visible means, yet hovering with absolute control. Less than 2 kilometers off the Halsey, leaned slightly toward the viewport, not in awe but in assessment, and replied in a measured tone that carried no anxiety, only calculation. It's a projection of conceptual hierarchy, not a weapon, not yet. The inner spirals are layered in Fibonacci rhythm, not because it's natural to them, but because they know it's natural to us. This isn't a threat. It's a calibration tool. They want to see how we respond to a structure that disrupts our logic while pretending to invite it. She turned toward the ship's central relay and spoke directly into the secure, diplomatic frequency reserved for non-human first contact negotiations. This is Ambassador Elin Jay of the United Human Directorate. We acknowledge the nature of your broadcast as structural intent signaling. We do not mimic. We respond on our own terms. If you are assessing human stability, you will find us neither binary nor erratic. We are interpreters of contradiction. And we ask only that you observe without assuming coherence is submission. For 7 full minutes, there was no shift in the lattice, no change in proximity or signature. Then slowly, it began to rotate counter to its original formation. New edges folding in, old spirals retracted, the form now reorganizing around an axis that mimicked the curvature of Sol's equatorial drift. They are not responding in kind. They are adapting the conversation into something else, Nayland said. And for the first time in his voice, there was the faintest hesitation. Not fear, but recognition. The way a strategist might pause before moving their piece because they realized the board itself was changing shape beneath their hand. Jay nodded once. Slowly, her expression calm, but sharpened at the edges now, because she understood what that rotation meant. They're not here to talk to governments. They're here to measure the cognitive viability of our species as a decision-making organism, she said. And when she said it, no one else on the deck said anything at all, because it was clear now that the black ship did not return to open peace or provoke war. It had returned to decide something. No human had the right to refuse. Sol Command had activated full strategic silence across all inter-system networks. But even silence left traces, and Vice Admiral Celine Roth knew that any species capable of rewriting satellite firmware mid-orbit could read intent from those traces just as clearly as words. The black ship's 3 escorts had shifted formation by 11 degrees toward Jupiter's moon field. No known weapon systems were primed, but their weight patterns suggested that they were scanning gravitic resonance for anomalies in planetary defense systems, which meant they weren't just watching, they were calculating structural resistance. Across Sol's orbit, like someone studying which pressure point would crack first if they ever chose to strike. Run Ghost Fleet Initiative across Mars and Venus with mirrored command overlays and heat emissions. Roth ordered without hesitation, her voice level and paced. Make it look like we're splitting command across 2 axis zones and leave one route intentionally exposed through the Earth-Luna corridor, but embed kinetic traps inside the supply lanes, so if they test us physically, we catch the probe before they see it coming. Captain Draven, seated at the secondary operations tier, didn't blink as he rerouted orbital nodes and sent false fleet coordinates pulsing into the black ship's sensor view. And as he did, he spoke low but steady, more to confirm Roth's line of thought than to question it. They're building a decision tree of our tactical responses. And they're using nonlinearity to stress test whether we can function outside predictable war doctrine. If we act purely defensive or symmetrical, they'll file us as structurally limited and move from observation to judgment, which is why we give them neither pattern nor panic, Roth said without turning. We give them adaptation under constraint, asymmetry under logic, and tolerance without submission. We show them we understand war without needing it to prove ourselves worthy of survival. In the lower comms deck, Director Venner was monitoring a deep spectrum analysis from the solar array at Mercury's edge, and a slow pulse began to rise. From the sun's outer corona imperceptible to civilian systems, but precise enough to repeat at exact mathematical intervals. A message not from Earth, but likely from the black ship itself. Solar harmonics are shifting again. They're modulating. Photon resonance through the sun's natural cycle. Not broadcasting at us, broadcasting through our star, he said, voice tighter now. Because this was no longer just a technological curiosity. It was a move that required a level of solar manipulation humanity had only theorized under Black Project conditions, which means the Helios Apocryphon project just became relevant. Again, Roth replied instantly, her hands already moving across the private console that accessed the oldest, restricted files in Soul Command's memory lattice. The kind of data buried so deep, it required both retinal match and a genetic ping from her own bloodline, because it had been designed that way. So no machine could ever awaken it by Axide and Traven looked toward her sharply. The gravity of that. Name not lost on anyone with classified clearance. We're seriously going to prime a protocol built to weaponize the star? He asked, not out of disbelief, but the kind of hard-earned caution that came from knowing when a contingency crossed into escalation. We're not weaponizing anything, Roth said as she locked the final key and sent the dormant instructions set into the prep network. We're going to show them that we can rewrite the light of our own system if necessary, not to blind them, but to prove that our understanding of power doesn't depend on aggression. It depends on the ability to restrain it until the moment. Restraint no longer protects life, and as she spoke, the solar lattice began to stir beneath Mercury's orbit, a field of dormant quantum anchors awakening like the quiet breath before a storm. And all across the command room, the silence returned, not of fear, but of recognition, because they were no longer managing an encounter. They were shaping a message that would travel not by radio or relay, but by the sun itself. The relay drone was launched from the shadow side of Mercury, shielded from direct solar exposure by its graphene composite hull, and cloaked under a whisper field that erased its heat signature from passive scans. And inside its narrow core was a single device, the solar harpoon, a one-of-a-kind prototype that had never been tested outside simulation, designed not to damage the sun, but to speak through it in frequencies no species had ever weaponized before Lieutenant Commander Ao. O'Keefe piloted the insertion vessel manually, despite AI auto-guidance being faster, because the mission required judgment, not speed, and because he had once been a particle physicist before joining the fleet. He understood the stakes in both mathematical terms and in the language of consequence. Once I breach the photonic threshold, I'll have less than 24 seconds to align the dispersion node, he said through the encrypted line back to Soul Command. The harpoon won't survive the flareback, and I won't either if the heat signature spikes beyond 0.7. But we only need a clean pulse, not a full cycle. Just one moment where the sun says something it was never meant to say. Roth's voice came back without hesitation, steady and unshaken, because leadership in this kind of operation didn't come from hope or sentiment. It came from clarity of outcome. Understood, Commander. Your launch is green. Confirm once the node syncs with heliometric layer 6. Our telemetry will route the pulse through the anchor grid and push the reflection directly across the black ship's orbital shadow. O'Keefe leaned into the control rig and adjusted the microflux dampeners, his eyes reading the real-time solar data like a language he'd spoken since birth. And as the ship screamed silently toward the outer corona, he felt no fear, only alignment with purpose. The harpoon deployed on schedule, piercing the photosphere, with a burst of regulated quantum energy that rewrote the harmonic signature of the local star layer for exactly 0.8 seconds. And in that blink of time, the sun rippled with a pattern that had never existed in nature binary matrices sculpted into ultraviolet, photon winds that said something without using words at all, from every sensor point across the system. The result was immediate. The black ship flickered out of the known spectrum, not destroyed, not disabled, not erased, just removed, as if the sun itself had momentarily declared the black ship incompatible with the reality it illuminated, as if humanity had hacked their presence through the very light that bathed the system they dared to test. And for that moment, every scanner and soul went blind to it. No retaliation followed immediately, no weapons deployed, no counterpulse struck Earth or Mars, or any of the human outposts in the outer rings. But something deeper shifted in that silence, something not technological, but relational, because for the first time, humanity had not just defended itself with strategy or weapons or negotiation. It had spoken back to a species they had never expected anyone to answer in kind through the language of a star. Black ship reappeared within 5 minutes. Not where it had been, but closer, now drifting along Earth's orbital rim with no declaration, no energy spike, and no formation shift, as though it had never left, as though what humanity had done was noted but not acknowledged, at least not in any language meant for recognition. There were no attacks on military assets, no data corruption, no systemic failures across the colonies. And for a full day, it appeared that the solar pulse had merely paused the game between species rather than reshaping it. Then Luna Archive went dark, the deep vaulted cultural repository beneath the Sea of Serenity, shielded by 20 meters of regolith and carbon-tempered alloy, home to every historical artifact and recorded philosophy of pre-interstellar Earth, was hit with a single directed burst that vaporized the outer plate, oiled the vacuum-hardened containment, and melted the memory lattice down to atomic debris without even so much as cracking the lunar crust beneath it. No casualties, no alarms, no warning. Just lost Celine Roth stood before the grav map of the lunar site with her jaw clenched and her eyes steady, not because she didn't feel the weight of it, but because she understood exactly what had been taken and what message it was meant to deliver. They didn't strike to punish us for the Sunlight Protocol, she said to the Council link, her voice controlled with the precision of a blade held perfectly still. They struck to erase the part of us that remembers. Not our weapons, not our strategy, but our meaning. They answered power with philosophy and turned our response into a question about what we value most when war isn't the immediate cost. Venner, viewing from the secondary command vault, leaned in toward the encrypted relay with a slow breath, his tone low and analytical, even as his mind raced through probability chains. They're reframing the encounter entirely. They're engaging us with ideological warfare, testing whether we anchor our civilization in memory or just in survival. This wasn't about hurting us. It was about measuring us and choosing what to remove in order to see what we rebuild first. At that, Roth turned from the display and gave the next command without looking at the approval cue. Unleash the recursive signal vector. I want Echo AI units seated across every open communication array. Full permissions. Counter-sentience engagement unlocked. Initiate conversation warfare protocols if they want meaning. We give them paradox. If they want philosophy, we show them what happens when human cognition doesn't yield to superior processing but folds it into a new structure. And across the solar network, buried beneath the surface-level pings and silent probes, humanity's answer began to travel not through ships or weapons, but through thought loops, logic traps, and mathematical riddles engineered to evolve with every analysis attempt. A network of encoded paradoxes designed not to defeat the black ship's mind, but to complicate it until it saw that simplicity could never contain the human condition within. 4 hours, their secondary vessel shifted erratically in orbit. A microcourse adjustment so slight, it barely registered, but the message was clear. They had felt the infection, because humanity had not struck back with missiles or retaliation, had responded with complexity. It was not a surrender, and it was not a ceasefire. But when the black ship moved into neutral orbit above Titan and activated the Concord beacon, an ancient truce protocol written into the oldest interstellar accords, it was understood by all factions watching that this was something rarer than peace. It was judgment deferred through dialogue. A tribunal was convened aboard Lex Volantis, the last surviving neutral station from the first cycle of the Concord, a place never meant to hold human voices, yet now filled with the quiet tension of two intelligences meeting in the shadow of what might still become war. The entity did not arrive in a ship, nor did it send an avatar that pretended to be biological. It manifested inside the tribunal chamber as a reflective humanoid form, sculpted from light-absorbing material. Its surface warped local temperature fields and refracted visual data without moving. Its presence anchored to the chamber floor not by gravity, but by choice. Ambassador Ilan J. stood alone before it, without an entourage, without armed escort. Her robes marked only with the insignia of the Directorate and the neural interface across her temple, glowing faintly from the translation link feeding her. The entity's structural shifts in real time. You chose a memory first, she said. Without formal preamble, you erased it not because it threatened you, but because it represented something you didn't yet understand. And that made it more dangerous than any ship we could deploy. You fear not war, but meaning, because you haven't decided yet whether species like ours deserve to carry it forward. The entity's surface shimmered and folded once, the mathematical response translating into core linguistic syntax through the AI. Species that remember without structural purpose are unstable. Your capacity for contradiction exceeds modeled efficiency. Your logic is recursive, and recursive logic invites collapse. Your pattern is unsustainable under known civilizational frameworks. Jay did not blink, nor did she allow her tone to harden, because this conversation had no room for emotion, only for the shaping of thought into consequence. And yet, she replied, you remain here, in this space, speaking with the very species you claim is unsustainable, which means your own framework is already adapting, or you wouldn't still be listening. The entity paused, a stillness that was not hesitation but recalibration, and when it replied, the signal cadence shifted downward by several degrees. Propose your framework. Jay inhaled once, slowly, because she had been waiting for that question since the moment Luna burned, and now the answer had to be more than diplomatic. It had to be definitive. You tested us with force, with silence, with loss, and with the annihilation of memory. We responded with misdirection, restraint, light, and paradox. We do not seek to mimic your order, nor disprove your superiority. We seek coexistence built not on alignment, but on asymmetry managed through mutual comprehension. We propose a shared crucible not of battle, but of origin, your systems. Our approach, one environment, one result. And for a moment, the entity's entire surface split open into a slow bloom of shifting geometry, then closed again without sound. Accepted, came the reply, as neutral as entropy itself. A new star system was designated, beyond mapped space, known only through shared coordinates exchanged without signal. One teststone world, one outcome. The system they chose had no official designation on human charts, though astrophysical archives referred to it as Zenthra 19, a red dwarf anchored in a field of ancient orbital debris and planetary corpses. A region sterilized by unknown forces long before humanity learned to split the atom. Its only remaining satellite, a barren moon locked in perpetual shadow beneath a gas giant's rusted rings. This was the Crucible. The terms were simple in outline, but infinite in implication. Terraform the dead moon using only local matter and non-invasive interference. No AI escalation, no imported life, no orbital manipulation beyond physics already present. And once equilibrium was established, defend it not against weapons, but against collapse. Engineered by Entity Zero, through forces beyond human definition humanity, sent no armada, no war fleet, and no political entourage. They sent a vessel, named Cantor's Hope, crewed not by specialists in destruction, but by thinkers, builders, and boundary walkers. Axopiron, systems ecologist and former quantum botanist, led the environmental team with a mind that could see temperature as structure and chemical bonds as musical rhythm. And he worked without machines that solved problems for him, relying instead on biological mathematics and harmonic seed vectors that could evolve inside volatile soil DR. Mina Kale, a child development psychologist turned educational neuroengineer, brought with her not weapons or theories, but a single student, a 9-year-old named Lesa, who had survived a colony breach on Eros and rebuilt her memory with abstract reasoning and emotional recursion. And it was Lesa who, after only 2 weeks on the Crucible moon, began drawing orbital patterns in the dust that matched the entity's original lattice with eerie, silent accuracy. Commander Sen Idris, former combat logistics and zero-G philosopher, handled defense protocols without building weapons, instead reinforcing weather patterns through induced resonance, using storms and ice shifts to absorb kinetic stress and delay entropy, refusing to hold ground through force when he could alter the battlefield itself. The moon transformed slowly, not through domination, but through negotiation with environment, with heat coaxed from mineral friction, water pulled from stratified ice beneath crustal shear lines, and life beginning not with engineered genomes, but with microflora crafted from solar-catalyzed protein chains. And when the entity triggered collapse, a pulse that began at the gravitational seams and initiated tectonic chaos, temperature destabilization, and atmospheric inversion, the humans did not shield the world or resist the chaos. They adapted it. Idris reversed the pressure pockets to generate thermal convection corridors that redirected the seismic wave into usable geothermal flow scale, rerouted atmospheric instability into cyclonic vapor spirals that accelerated oxygen bonding. And Lesa stood at the edge of a cliff and drew shapes in the wind with her fingers that the moon followed it, did not survive unchanged. It survived transformed. And when the entity's observation craft ran its final scan, the report it generated was not a threat assessment. It was an acknowledgement of irreducible complexity. Because humanity had not dominated the Crucible, they had become part of its survival. The black ship reappeared in soul space 3 days after the Crucible event, not in secret and not at a distance this time, but in clear line-of-sight orbit over Earth's equator, positioned just above the magnetic pole lines where satellite paths converged. And for the first time in recorded contact history, it did not emit silence. It left something behind. A single object, ejected with no propulsion and no flare signature, fell into stable orbit like a gift from a forgotten god. It was small, no larger than a civilian transport shuttle, shaped like a prism with a surface that bent not just light but causality itself, refracting not colors but impressions, images that flickered through minds rather than lenses. When it was brought aboard the diplomatic station Callisto Arc, the prism did not resist analysis, but it did not yield to it either. It unfolded slowly, revealing layer by layer what it had come to return. The first was the Luna archive. Every historical record, every cultural memory, every voice erased from the Sea of Serenity had been restored in perfect fidelity, down to the harmonic inconsistencies in analog recordings, as if the entity had not destroyed it in spite or fear, but scanned it to understand why humans had built it in the first place. And now, after the Crucible, decided that memory was no longer a threat, but the archive was only the beginning. Beneath the recovered knowledge sat something new, a star map, not a blank grid or an invitation to conquest, but a carefully annotated atlas of systems previously redacted from galactic records, each one marked with entity glyphs that translated through recursive logic into human data streams viable, unmapped, unclaimed. Beneath those coordinates, embedded in the deepest thread of the prism's core, was a final transmission rendered, not in voice or code, but in a sequence of solar resonances identical to the Sunlight Protocol. Pulse humanity had once used to alter their own star's song. Translation came in slowly through the AI interpreters. Not a threat, not a demand, but a single idea, stripped of ceremony and excess. Survived them better than we did. Celine Roth, standing aboard Callisto Arc, watched the prism pulse once more before its final surface sealed shut, and she did not speak for several seconds, not out of uncertainty, but because she understood that this was not a warning from a superior force. It was a passing of the torch from something older, something that had once stood where humanity stood now, and made choices with consequences they could never undo. Humanity had not conquered the Black Ship. They had been invited into a chapter of survival that now belonged to them alone. They called it the Quiet Expansion. Not because there were no announcements, no banners unfurled in orbit, no celebratory messages relayed through deep space relays, but because the expansion was understood, not declared. Humanity had been given access not to territory, but to testimony. Every system marked on the entity's star map was a place they had once touched and failed to hold. Some collapsed under entropy, others under hubris, and a few under species far less patient than humanity had proven to be. Sol Command restructured. The Directorate transformed. The Concord, once a patchwork of hesitant signatories and factional constraints, voted in majority to grant Earth full Sentinel status, a classification reserved only for species that had passed existential thresholds and shown the ability to adapt without erasure. Vice Admiral Selene Roth retired not into silence, but into advisory protocol. Her final order had been quiet transfer Helios Apocryphon from containment to curriculum, not as a weapon blueprint, but as a lesson in restraint. That technology now belonged to humanity not as fire, but as Memory Ambassador Ilan J. remained in orbit, establishing the first multilateral station at the edge of entity map space, where philosophers, war analysts, terraformation ecologists, and even children worked side by side to plan expansions with the same mindset that once saved a lifeless moon. No conquest, only cohabitation. Laius grew into one of the most prominent figures of the Quiet Expansion. Her drawings became mathematical frameworks. Her silence became the new measure of diplomatic tension. And when alien species that had once ignored or undermined humanity began requesting mediation through her station, they did not do so out of fear, but because humanity had become something uninterpretable by simple metrics. Were no longer the species with fast ships or clever tricks. They were the species that spoke through stars and in deep space, beyond even the systems marked. On the prism map, observers watched. They did not intervene. They did not test. They only waited, listening to see if this young civilization would carry the torch or let it burn. The Black Ship never returned, but it didn't need to, because the last message it left behind still lived in every action that followed, not carved into monuments or coded into military doctrines, but in the quiet decisions made when no one was watching, when power was present and restraint was chosen anyway. Humanity had not been taught to survive. They had learned to endure without losing who they were, and in that endurance, the galaxy found something rare, a future not inherited but earned.